Ibn Battuta, the most noted explorer of the medieval world, narrated a series of first-hand, comprehensive and historically precious observations on lands to which he traveled over almost 30 years in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler passed through countless communities, cities and lands, and his observations, experiences and encounters have much to tell about the world and its workings in medieval times. Guided and inspired by Ibn Battuta's footsteps, this podcast opens a portal into the world of the East for people who are curious about the past, hungry for the marvels of traveling, and contemplate the wonders of cities. Accompany us over our journeys into the distant, unfamiliar, and unknown. Welcome to another episode of Oriental Journeys podcast. My name is Ray Behboudi and I'm your host as we take this journey of wonders together. The Arab world is enormously vast and diverse in every imaginable way, and yet is deeply rooted in a lineage of shared values. Over 3 millennia, these evolving values have been transmitted from generation to generation and traverse territories that stretch across the swathes of Western Asia and North Africa, connecting diverse Arab peoples dispersed throughout this land. These circumstances have evolved into exceptional spirit of solidarity within a collective culture that is generally termed Arab nation. Coming from an Arabised background, traveling across much of the Arabdome in medieval Islamic world, Ibn Battuta's depictions of Arab cultures as he encountered them provides a perfectly inspired itinerary as we delve into the multi-layered and composite history of the Arab peoples, tribes, and empires. In this episode, we walk through murky centuries which witnessed the dawn of Arab peoples, up until the restless 6th century, an era which revolutionized Arab people's worldview before the emergence of Islam in 7th century. We are led on this journey once again by the eminent scholar and historian Tim Mackintosh-Smith, who is an Arabist, historian, traveler, lecturer, and translator. Born in England and educated at Oxford University, he has lived for decades in the Yemeni capital Sana'a, but is currently nomadic. He is one of the foremost scholars of Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta. He has written a trilogy recounting his journeys in the footnotes of Ibn Battuta and made a well-received 3-part TV series for BBC on Ibn Battuta. His most recent work, which was published in 2019 by Yale University Press, is Arabs, a 3,000-year history of peoples, tribes, and empires, which covers 3 millennia of Arab history and shines a light on the Arab peoples and tribes. Hello team, it's good to have you again here. We had some very great conversations with you on the world of Ibn Battuta when we started our podcast, and now setting out again to explore an area in which your research has focused on Arabs.
It's great to be back. It's lovely to see you again. The listeners are just hearing our voices, but I can see you. Wonderful to see you again.
Wonderful, the same here. Before diving into our topic today, during our conversations by email, you revealed your friends have called your recent book on Arab history a monster piece, and that you yourself call it a fat tome. Can you tell me what's behind this colorful language?
Yeah, a monster piece. That was a friend of mine, Professor Georgi, who's got very colourful language himself. It kind of stuck in my memory as being a very apt word. I don't know if it's a masterpiece, but it's a monster of a book. It's literally a fat tome, as I said. And, the reason is there in the title. It's covering 3,000 years. The history of a people who now number, over 400 million. And it covers a huge geographical region, which, if you think of the sort of Arab world today, or the Arabophone, the Arabic-speaking world, you're talking about it going from the Atlantic to the Gulf. But really, it's kind of bigger than that even. It may sound surprising, but Brazil is the 9th largest Arab country by population. And if it was a question, what's the 9th largest Arab country? People might say Lebanon or somewhere. Not many people would say Brazil. Well, what I mean by that is that the population of people of Arab descent in Brazil, if you put them together into one country, they would be number 9 in the list of Arab countries. And they're all over the place. So I didn't just look at the kind of central bit of the Arab world, Middle East and North Africa. I had to cast a glance over all these other places. So that makes the book big. Something that makes it doesn't really double it in size, but it adds 50% onto it, is the fact that I try to look properly at the period before Islam. If you look at the first historical, in other words, written mention of Arabs, it dates from, I think, 853 BC. I realized that, in fact, Islam comes right in the middle of the period from 853 BC to the present. Islam is very much in the middle chronologically. And a lot of historians of Arabs, they start with Islam. They say, the Arabs burst onto the world stage with the beginning of Islam, which in a sense they did, because they emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. But of course, they had a long history before that. We don't know as much about it, but we do know quite a bit, and we can piece quite a lot together. So that makes my book longer. It makes it a fat tome, yes.
That's very clear now, and why your friends have used those colorful languages. And your explanation just connects to my next question. Your book covers a truly vast scope, as you said, and you artistically have condensed major epoch of Arabs' history over 3,000 years into 600 pages. How did you organize such a huge volume of raw historic material? Did you have any sort of techniques, or how did you manage that?
I try to look at the big arcs, if you like, the big shapes. I would call that sort of a deeper kind of history, or a history that is actually telling a story. So I try to tell a story with my history and not just overload people with dates. And I try to start each chapter with an anecdote, something that you will remember and which sticks in the mind, but somehow encapsulates the period that chapter or section covers. But I obviously do have a chronological organization or order. So I basically, I call the parts emergence, revolution. I'm talking about the beginnings of, the appearance of the Prophet Muhammad, and which really was a revolution, and it is immensely important in Arab history as well as Islamic history. So emergence, revolution, dominance, decline, that's when the Turks and the others begin to take over, and then eclipse, which is really when the Ottoman Empire kind of rises and dominates everything, and you have European colonialism. And then what I call re-emergence, so the Arab awakening, so from about 1800 or a bit later until the present day. I mean, obviously everything has ups and downs, but those are my main chronological divisions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You incorporate this huge history into cyclic storytelling that starts with the dawn and ends with the re-emergence.
Yes, cycles are a good way of looking at history. I mean, they're not a foolproof way of looking at history, but it's certainly how Ibn Khaldun, probably the greatest Arab historian, looked at history. I'm working on him at the moment, by the way. So he's very much on my mind, and he looked at the cycles of history.
In your biography, you have identified, or you normally identify yourself as an Arabist. And you have also lived in Yemen for decades. You have also written a monograph on Arab, as we were talking about. So tell me, what is attracting you to this realm?
Well, it's quite deep-seated, I suppose. My dad was very fond of travel books, and he collected travel books and had quite a nice little library of volumes that I would look in when I was quite small. I remember things like, even really before I could read, there's a lovely book by Freya Stark, the famous British traveller in the Arab world and other places in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. And she did a lovely picture book called Scene in the Hadramaut. And I remember looking at this when I was little and being enchanted by these strange sort of mud skyscrapers and tribesmen. And there was a particular picture of an old guy who had a bub, it's called in Arabic, a spiny-tailed lizard clutching his chest, and I think it was a pet. And I just thought, these people look weird and wonderful, I suppose, as you do when you're little. something that I always go back to as an influence was the World of Islam Festival, which was held in Britain, a lot of events in London in I think 1975. And I remember going and seeing that, they had like a mock-up of the souk in Sana'a in the Museum of Mankind. And that was fascinating. That really kind of fired me to want to go there. It was more kind of the presence of, like you had the 1973 war, where, the war with the Israelis, where the Arabs used the price of oil very, very cleverly to put pressure on the West. And suddenly sort of Arabs were big news, and suddenly they had a lot more money, and suddenly, there were a lot of Arabs in London wandering around, and it was quite a sort of Arab decade in the West, the 1970s. And I suppose, the Festival of Islam partly came out of this. That's really my background. But yeah, as I was going to say, I started off at university as a classicist, Latin and Greek, and then I realized that I was kind of a bit bored with it. I'd been doing it for too long. And I thought, let's have a go at Arabic. It was like, this incredible, wacky world being blown open. And in my book about Yemen, I start in what I call dictionary land, which is Harvard's dictionary of 1915. Just leafing through the dictionary, it just kind of blew my mind. The fact of the richness of words. What I was going to quote a bit from is this. One of my colleagues, David Larson, he's translated Ibn Khaldun's study called The Names of the Lion. And the lion is supposed to have 500 names in Arabic, and just completely at random. A taithar, indiscriminate of whom he faces, also said of the mosquito. So the lion and the mosquito share the same name. And I mean, that literally was randomly opening the book. Al-Athamtham. What a brilliant name, Al-Athamtham. I'd never heard of that before. It's completely new to me now. But it supposedly means huge and ponderous, also said of a camel. Al-Fat is usually a cheetah, but you can apply it to a lion. Dilhath, one who strides unflinching into battle. Also said of a she-camel. So, I mean, the camel is meant to have, the lion is meant to have 500 names. The camel's meant to have 1,000. I think that's probably an underestimate.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to touch this theme later on in our conversation about this copious lexicon of Arabic language.
Yes. But it's just the fact that one of the best dictionaries, old dictionaries of Arabic, is called Al-Qamus al-Muhit, the encompassing ocean. And that's really what Arabic is like. I called it dictionary land, but it's really a sort of enormous ocean that you never end swimming in. And I just want to give a very short anecdote. One of my most memorable Arabic teachers was Alan Jones at Oxford, later professor of Arabic at Oxford. And he always used to say to us, don't worry, it may seem difficult, but it's only the first 20 years which are difficult of learning Arabic. I saw him a few years ago, just before he died, actually. We had dinner. And I said, Professor Jones, do you remember you used to say only the first 20 years are difficult? And he looked at me and he said, did I? I should have said the first 60 years.
The bar has been raised.
Yeah, he'd been deep in Arabic for 60 years and about to die, and he felt he was still swimming in this ocean.
The word Arabs. What does it mean? How do you explain the term, the Arab nation, al-Sha'b al-Arabi?
I'm not sure that I would say a Sha'b al-Arabi. Maybe I'll come back to that later. But yeah, what does Arabs mean? If you're going to write a big fat book, first define your term. And it's really got one main title, Arabs. It's very difficult to say what the word means because I think I likened it in the book to a label. I mean, all names are labels. But the label Arab or Arabs it's very broad and it's very sticky, but it's also very slippery. It's tended to change over the years. I think to begin with, it probably meant people who live on the margins, people who live by herding camels, domesticating camels, people who transport things across the empty wastes. It's that kind of thing. And that has always persisted to some extent. But then, you got an Arab culture growing up, which was very much connected with the language. And that sort of reflected back. The Prophet Muhammad is called the Arab prophet or the Arabian prophet. I'm never quite sure which is, because the English distinguishes between the culture and the setting. Whichever it means, in Arabic it means, I think, that he was the channel of this incredible divine revelation, the Quran, which came down in Arabic. And it came to a people who spoke the Arabic language, who were not necessarily all camel nomads, far from it. But by the time of Prophet and the beginning of Islam, the word Arab had come to mean have a cultural sense. And it's always had this sort of double meaning or even multiple meaning. I mean, if you look, you talked about Ibn Battuta, if you look at the way he uses Arabs, more often than not, he uses it as of tribesmen dwelling in the desert or the steppe lands or that kind of thing. It has waves of meaning, the word. The one thing that holds it all together, and which we will also come back to, is language. You know, it's a sort of slippery sense, a slippery label, but it's very sticky. You know, it's lasted for 3,000 years. When you said a Sha'b al-Arabi, I don't know, maybe Arab nationalism is called Qawmiya. But of course, yeah, there is an Arab cultural nation, whatever their origins may be genetically, but they do share values, they share outlooks, and of course they share this language. So that's really what has created this Arab nation.
I think this is like a very good component for the next question, which I would like to ask. When we talk about the Arabs, it seems that we refer to clearly identifiable body of people, while we also know that Arab peoples are tremendously diverse in their lifestyles, dialects, cultural preferences, and of course political orientations. We can see these days now. What is it that glues these different groups together under the identifier of being Arab, and what core elements make up this ethnic compound?
I really think it is language. Obviously, Islam plays a huge role, an enormous and important and central role in Arab history, but not all Arabs are Muslims. It is language that I centre on in my book. You know, a lot of people sort of say, yes, it tells the story, but it tells the story of language as much as anything else. It does. It tells the story also of migration, you know, the way that language holds migration together. So, for example, or rather unites the strands. So you can get, without going into the details, you can get like a quirk of a dialect that was found in Eastern Arabia. And you can get it, I think still today, in people of Arab origin in Central Asia, also in somewhere in Sahelian, if that's the right word, Africa, I think somewhere near Lake Chad. And you get this same quirk, which couldn't have arisen in both places. It has to come from the same origin. So Arabs migrated, obviously, with the conquest, with Islam, and they took their language with them. And, you know, their political unity, what didn't last very long. But this linguistic, cultural unity is what lasted. And it goes back a long way. Obviously, Islam, the Quran, the first Arab book, immensely important. But even before Islam, you had kings of Arab origin who were promoting poets and attracting them to their courts. And this is where kind of consciousness of being Arab came about. You get these old, I think they were mainly German, people like Herder, scholars who were at the root of thinking about European nationalism. And I think it was Herder who said that the poet makes the nation. And I believe you can say something like this about Arabic as well, that there was this wonderful poetic language which traveled along the trade routes and later along the routes of migration that held everything together. That's the glue.
This is fabulous. And I think it was a really good and matching segue so that we can go back into the emergence of the Arabs. The Arab story is more about peoples than places, as there is Odyssey rather than Iliad. This is a thought-provoking statement that you have made in your book. What's the context of this statement, and what are the earliest historic traces of Arabs as a distinct body of people?
What I said about the Arab story being an epic, but yes, it's more Odyssey than Iliad. And really what I meant was that the Odyssey is obviously kind of an epic in motion. The Iliad is much more in one place. It's all centering around Troy. But the Odyssey is about journeys, if you like, a search for home, a search for identity, if a return to identity. And this is part of the Arab story. You know, I think migration, as I said, along with language, is one of the big factors in creating a sense of Arab identity. It's sort of history in motion. And I talk about the grammar of history. I talk about periods where Arabs are active and periods when they're more passive. You know, when things are happening to them, caused by the Ottomans, caused by the growth of Western colonialism, imperialism, etc. But I think you can kind of look at a grammar of history. The important parts of Arab history are when they are active, when they're on the move, when they're transitive, to use another grammar term, when what they do affects other people. And I realized this just recently looking at Ibn Khaldun's history, and he calls it in Arabic Kitab al-Ibar, the book of examples, admonitions, something like that, warnings even, وَدِيوَانُ الْمُبْتَدَأ وَالْخَبَرِ, which is a kind of grammatical term. And some people have translated it as kind of earlier history and later history, but it also has a grammatical sense of the way Arabic grammar works. This is the cause, this is the effect, to boil it down to its very basic. I think Arab history does have this grammar of being active and passive. And of course, the time of Islam was the almost hyperactive phase.
The analogy you use was like a fabulous analogy, and I can see that the connections between the grammar of Arabic and the history of Arabic. Can you give us some more example or any evidence that where this grammar or when this grammar emerged?
Well, if you turn from grammar to the actual language, as I said, the first actual inscription, the first sort of historical evidence for an Arab is 850 something BC. So, but of course, he didn't come from nowhere, and there were Arabs before that. Really, the only way we can trace them back is through language, and it's not through inscriptions. It's through this extrapolating backwards of looking at a language and imagining back, taking its building blocks apart and going back, archaeologizing the language and taking it right back to its earliest levels. By doing this, people with enormously big brains, probably computers as well, have worked out that Arabic might have emerged something like 5,000 or 4,000 years ago as a language. It's still really among the Semitic, as it's called, family of languages, it seems to be the oldest. And the rule of thumb in looking at linguistic development is that languages simplify over time. In English, this is the man whom I saw. Who says whom these days? I might do, but not many people do. So you lose endings and so on. But Arabic, at least in its sort of standard proper form, it has a lot of features, really complicated features, which seem to prove that it is very, very old. Very old, ancient and hoary, and as much as perhaps 5,000 years old.
Aside from the linguistic landscape, when historians and archaeologists study this theme, do you have anything top of your mind saying that, these were archaeological evidences? They mention the people of Arabs literally.
Well, yeah, you have these Assyrian inscriptions, so from pretty early on in the first millennium BC, and you get mentions in Greek literature pretty early on. As for actual archaeological evidence from Arabs themselves, I think by nature of the life that they lived, and they probably did live out in tents in the steppe and so on, herding camels. There's not an awful lot to go on. I make a point in my history for saying that you can look at language as like sort of archaeological remains, whereas other people had houses, houses with doors and things like that. It's actually Arabic poetry that has houses and doors. And what do I mean? A line of Arabic verse is called a bait, which is the word for a house or a dwelling. It has two halves of the bait. One of them is called a shatr, or it's called a misra, which is a half of an opening door. There are features where kind of poetry is like a building. So you can look at very early Arab poetry, 6th century, possibly things that are earlier a bit, and you can kind of look at what it tells us about the life of Arabs in those times. I mean, otherwise it's quite difficult. You can look at places like Qaryat al-Faw in current Saudi Arabia, which was a very early sort of caravan town, which covered a few hundred years across the beginning of from BC to AD and into the 3rd century and later. So you can look at things like that, which is where people of apparently Arab origin and settled origin were mingling and trading. It was kind of a bit like a proto-Mecca, if you like. So there is archaeology there. But these sort of nomads who were your actual Arabs, by virtue of being nomads, they don't leave much behind.
Moving on from the history traces into geography, I would like to know, are there any geographic boundaries which have been predominantly resided by Arabs over the past 3,000 years? Which land specifically can be called Arabia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose Arabia, or Arabia, I suppose it's really a Latin. You had Arabia Deserta, Arabia Petraea, Desert Arabia, Rocky Arabia, and Arabia Felix, happy Arabia, fortunate Arabia, southern part. In a sense, that tells us something. I mean, I think Arabs themselves, like all other speakers of related languages, came from the Fertile Crescent. I don't think there's much doubt about that. We don't really know how they originated, but it seemed that they might well have been settled people, and for whatever reasons, they took off into the unknown, into the desert. So, yeah, talking about the Levant, like Syria, Lebanon, through there, really the borders of Egypt and through into Iraq, the land of the two rivers, and that sort of fertile region, which makes a sort of crescent shape. I would say that Yemen and southern Arabia in general forms another fertile crescent. And in fact, I call it the southern fertile crescent. To think of there being the two fertile crescents, one in the north, Syria, Iraq, one in the south, Yemen, into what's now Sultanate of Oman. And so it's like two brackets. And in the middle, you have an empty space, which has never, of course, been completely empty. Deserts and steppes are never empty. But that was really the sort of sphere of where Arabs were moving around, probably up in the northern part to begin with, but gradually coming further south. Nature abhors a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. Vacuums always get filled by things. And Arabs were the people who filled that vacuum between the two fertile crescents. And it's an interesting region, the Arabian Peninsula. I think I make the point that it's rather like the Indian subcontinent in size. It's rather like kind of Western Europe in size. It's different from those two other places because there aren't really barriers. All right, there are bits of sandy desert that are difficult to cross, but there aren't impossible barriers. So people have always moved around. And once they domesticated the camel, whenever that was, a couple of thousand BC, probably for milk and meat, and then later on for riding, they were able to make use of this empty space between the two parentheses, the two fertile crescents.
Perfect. You also mentioned the terms Semitic. In digging down amidst the roots of ethnicities in modern literature, we heard a lot about these terms, Semitic. Although the roots of this racial classification are, as I said, still controversial, but which branches of the ethnicity tree are called Semitic? And could we include Arabs?
Again, it goes back to German scholars in the 18th century. They were looking at languages and obviously seeing that Arabic, Hebrew, and a whole clutch of other languages are very, very closely related. They wanted to give this language family a name. They went back to the Bible and for that matter to the Quran and to Abraham and realized that according to traditional biblical Quranic genealogy, speakers of Arabic and Hebrew, they descend from Abraham. So I suppose they said, who does Abraham come from? He's a descendant of Sam or Shem, the son of Noah, Sam ibn Nuh in Arabic. So that's why the language family really ended up being called the family of the Shem or the Sam or the Semitic languages. Of course, in recent years, the term has been monopolized by one branch of it. Strictly, technically speaking, being an anti-Semite would mean that you were anti all the descendants of Shem, which includes not only Jews but also Arabs and all the other branches. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
No, I think you put it in the context. We know that this is like a more linguistic things rather than any other things.
That's absolutely what it came from. And really the term has been monopolized, or I might even say hijacked, a term that began as a linguistic term.
Talking about the traces of Arabi people in Arabia Peninsula, one of the most charming traces emerged, Sephardic graffitis. What Sephardic graffitis are, where are they found, and what do they indicate about Arab peoples?
Okay, yeah, these Sephardic inscriptions or graffiti, as you call them, they are extraordinarily interesting. I talked about this early inscriptional evidence that goes back to the 9th century BC. The Sephardic graffiti are probably quite a lot later. end of the first millennium BC and into first millennium AD. How we can link them through to Arabs is that they use a language. They're written in Nabatean script, but the language is what linguists call North Arabian, as opposed to South Arabian, which was used by the Spaeans and so on. But North Arabian is really the branch of Semitic languages from which Arabic came. And actually, I'm no inscriptional expert, but if I see them transcribed, I can understand quite a lot. And to me, they look like a form of Arabic. There is sort of very early evidence of people who spoke what became Arabic being in particularly those northern areas. And they're called Safaitic because a Safa is the name for some of the sort of northern deserts that go into Syria, southern Syria, northern Saudi Arabia on the present map. And yeah, they're absolutely fascinating.
Where can they be seen?
Oh, all over the place. There are tens of thousands of them on rocks in the desert. They're quite strange because it seems that they were written by probably camel herds or herders of whatever who found a bit of greenery and were pasturing their flocks, and they were as bored as hell, whereas we might do a Sudoku or something on our phones. They wrote these inscriptions. People have thought, well, you'd expect these people to be illiterate, but no, they picked up the Nabatean alphabet, and it seems that they sort of played around with it, almost as a game. They were really into genealogy. A lot of them have genealogies. People write in graffitis things like, I don't know, Rehana was here or Tim was here, and people write things like that, but they don't just say Tim. They say, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so. Some of them go back like 12, 15 generations. And people with immense patience have actually looked at these and have kind of put some of them together. So there was that, but you occasionally get more interesting things. You get declarations of love, you get declarations of loss. They're the sort of subjects that feed into Arabic poetry later on.
That's going to be, I think, very good spot to get connected to the next question. Arabic-speaking cultures are suffused with some of the most profound poetry ever composed. How is Arabic poetry connected to the Safaitic graffitis themes, and what were some of the inspirations for poetry in those old days?
Well, it's a good question, and I would say that I'm being quite inventive in my history when I say that there is a connection, because the graffiti are not poems. But what I am saying is that some of the subjects that pop up in them also pop up in the poetry that probably dates from several hundred years later and was transmitted orally. For example, there's an inscription which was written by someone called, he might have been Salim or Salim or Salam or something like that. We don't know because they didn't put in the vowels. And his son has died. He's addressing the goddess, Allat, and sort of saying, please bring me comfort for his death. Mourning poetry is a very powerful and beautiful feature of early Arabic poetry. You get people like Al-Khansa, the famous female poet who mourns her brother, and Haritha, whose son was taken in a raid. You kind of, to me, they're expressing the same emotions. That Salim or whatever his name was, he says something like, he was oppressed by sadness. And you feel the same oppression in that mourning poetry.
These are gorgeous examples. They're very emotional sentiments coming out of them.
And both Al-Khansa and Haritha, they say, person so dear to me was lost, and their memory comes back with the setting of the sun and with its rising in the morning. And so, there's a poetic spirit that crosses ages and cultures, but I think there is a link in the subjects. There are Safaitic graffiti that say, so-and-so was madly in love with so-and-so, and they had a jolly time together. These kinds of things pop up in quite early Arabic poetry.
Here, I would like to shift to an influential pairing of opposites. In Arab culture, we have a pairing of opposites as Bedouins versus settled. First, let's listen to a passage from Ibn Battuta Troubles, and we will continue our conversation afterwards.
I stayed only one night in Cairo before setting out for Syria. This was in the middle of Sha'ban of the year 726. I then travelled to the town of Balbais. It is a large town with many fruit gardens. I came next to As-Salihiyya, after which we entered the sands and halted at the post stations on the way through, such as As-Sawada, Al-Warrada, Al-Mutaylib, Al-Arish, and Al-Kharruba. At each of these stations there is a hostelry, funduq, which they call khan, where travellers alight with their beasts. And outside each khan is a public watering place and a shop at which the traveller may buy what he requires for himself and his beast. Amongst these stations is the well-known place called Qatya, where zakat is collected from the merchants, their goods are examined, and their baggage most rigorously searched. There are government offices there, with officers, clerks, notaries, and its daily revenue is 1,000 gold dinars. No one may pass this place in the direction of Syria without a passport from Egypt, nor into Egypt without a passport from Syria, as a measure of protection for a person's property and of precaution against spies from Iraq. This road is under guarantee of the Bedouins. That is to say, they have been made responsible for guarding it. At nightfall, they smooth down the sand so that no mark is left on it. Then the governor comes in the morning and examines the sand. If he finds any track on it, he requires the Arabs to fetch the person who made it, and they set out in pursuit of him and never fail to catch him. They then bring him to the governor, who punishes him as he sees fit.
Ibn Battuta has beautifully described Arab Bedouins and their unique set of skills in tracing trespassers in the 14th century. Also, interestingly, in your book, one central theme is a paired opposites of settled versus Bedouins, or Hadar versus Bad, and the definitely role this opposition plays in understanding the Arab culture. How did this dynamic play out between Bedouins and settled peoples when Nabateans and the charming civilization of Petra emerged in the eastern part of Arab Peninsula as like a settled civilization?
Well, yeah, I'll come to the Nabateans in a bit, but certainly Ibn Battuta's description there, it tells us about the Bedouins, the Bedou were good at, they were good at tracking and following people. In a sense, it tells us something more important, which is that they were there in the service of the settled states, in the margins between them, as buffers, as border guards, as clients. And this is a role that Arabs seem to have played right from those earliest inscriptions from the Assyrians, that they were involved in sort of protecting the margins of empires, smoothing out the margins, in this case of the quotation that you read. There's this kind of symbiosis. I don't think one could have got on without the other. It's sometimes very easy and very glib to see things in dualities. People like to see dualities. And I think there's a danger with Hadar and Bed, settled people and nomads, that you could see them as a duality. Ibn Khaldun, who I keep coming back to because he's so brilliant, saw them really for what they are, that they kind of feed into each other. His model is not perfect, it can't be used everywhere, but he saw the nomadic people kind of forming settled states, and then other nomadic people coming and taking them over. So you get a cycle where one blurs into the other. And of course, it's very, very rare to get nomads who are total nomads, always on the move. And usually there is this coexistence. A perfect example is that of Mecca. Mecca at the emergence of Islam, it was a trading town, but it had to rely on the Arabs, meaning the camel people, to transport its goods. The Prophet Muhammad can talk about the Arab, meaning those people who use camels and transport the goods, whereas at the same time he is the Arabi prophet in that he uses the Arabic language. So there was this getting on together. I think one of the great achievements of Islam, quite apart from anything else, it brought together the old Hadar, the settled people of the south, and the more mobile tribes. And really Mecca itself is a kind of paradigm for this. As for the Nabateans, they were quite similar. They had a state which thrived on trade, and obviously they traded with the Romans and so on, and they had Petra and wonderful places like that. But they spoke some form of Arabic. They had to rely on the nomadic Arabs to transport their goods for them. So there's always this symbiosis. And I think partly why I call my history 3,000 years of peoples, tribes, and empires. And the peoples and tribes I've taken directly from the Quran, where it talks about ash-shu'ub wal-qaba'il. People have interpreted these words in different ways. People have thought of ash-shu'ub as maybe being the Persians. But and it's not just me. No, there are other interpreters who see them as talking about the settled peoples in Arabia, because all those old settled peoples in the south, Saba, Himyar, Qataban, Ma'in, Hadramaut, they were all called Sha'ab, Sha'ab Saba, Sha'ab Himyar. And the Sha'ab, their identity was based on place and mutual support, whereas the Qaba'il were the tribes, the Arab tribes, whose identity was based on descent, as we can see in those Safavitic inscriptions.
You also mentioned this legendary mobility of Arabs. As you said, that there were no specific barriers, like a natural barriers. There were only sands that they could move along. They were just moving across settled neighboring empires and between caravan cities, as you also touched upon. Largely was owed to camels and horses. What layers of identity did these domesticated animals add into Arab culture?
Oh, I think they're absolutely essential. I think if you hadn't had camels, you wouldn't have had Arabs. Do I mean it that way round, or do I mean it the other way round? No, I think I mean it that way round. I think camels enabled Arabs to live the lives that they lived, but they were circumscribed. They were kind of stuck in that space between the two fertile crescents. And I think what enabled them really to get going and eventually to burst out of it with the Islamic conquest or the Arab conquest, whichever you want to call it, was the addition of the horse. Because, you can do wonderful things with camels. You can cross immense distances and not have to have much water, but you can't fight wonderfully well on a camel. I've never tried myself, but I don't think it's that easy. Whereas if you have a horse, you can gallop into battle onwards into the Valley of Death, rode the 600 and that kind of thing. And the Light Brigade, you need horses to win a lot of battles, but you can't take horses across deserts because you haven't got their necessary, fodder and water. But you have if you've got camels, and the camels can carry it, and then the horses can have a nice time, eat their fill, and you can have the two together. And there are all sorts of bits of Arabic poetry where you've got so-and-so. Oh, there's a lovely one. I can't remember his name, but he was a sheikh, and he was on his camel, and the wind was tugging at his cloak as he trotted along on his camel, and there twinkled Toad beside him, paced his horse, kind of ready to jump onto and jump into the fray. So they were this kind of perfect double act. It's like having a baggage train and a Lamborghini, or a sort of a juggernaut and a Lamborghini together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and talking about the camels, we know that Arabs have many distinct words for describing camels, which is one example only that reflects the richness of Arabic language. The other examples can be the many words Arabs use for dates. You also mentioned the lions. As you state in your book, Arabic is the most copious language in vocabulary. What contextual factors in Arab nomadic lives cause this lexical richness?
I think the context was having a context but not having much material to fill the context. What I mean is, today we're absolutely surrounded by stuff, things that even when I was young we didn't have. Laptops, phones, everything else. And all these things have to have names. So the actual number of words, names, is increasing and increasing. If you're a guy herding camels in the desert with nothing to do but scratch your ancestors on a rock, that you haven't actually got very much in your life. But people 2,000 years ago essentially had the same amount of brain power that we've got. I suppose they had to use it for something. So they were very, very specific about things, which is why you get all these words for particular types of camels and, colours of camels and things like that, but also lots of other things that come from that context. things that we wouldn't even look at. So, for example, there's a particular word for the dropping of an ostrich, and it's different from the word for the dropping of a bustard. And if you measure things with your fingers, it has a word for the space between each of the fingers.
Oh, I haven't even thought about it.
Oh, don't you know? This is a shibr, which is, it's a span, but the small span between the index finger and the thumb is called a fitr. So things like that. And if you live in this context that doesn't have much material in it, you will be very precise about your nomenclature of that material. Although I must say, I think there were these early Islamic philologists, who went around collecting words for things, and I think they were a bit kind of crackpot, and they really kind of got a lot of fun out of collecting the words for the droppings of different birds and so on. And I mean, you get books that have chapters like this: 80 words for honey, and the 200 words for a beard, and the 500 for a lion, and the 1,000 for a camel, and the whatever else. People loved lists.
Long lists. Yeah, and very, very interesting examples. You raised yourself the Sha'b al-Sabah and the Shabs. They were residing in the southern Fertile Crescent. Let's traverse the empty quarter, Rab al-Khali, and get into the settled south, Yemen. Maybe now is a good time to bring up Sabaeans, another mysterious civilization in the Arabia Peninsula. Further towards the south, when did the dynasty begin and end, and were people of Sabah themselves regarded themselves as Arab?
Yeah, they are a bit mysterious, the Sabaeans, in that people do have different dates about their kings and their dynasty and even their appearance in the south. They probably came like other people from the northern Fertile Crescent. People have suggested, I think, a couple of thousand BC or something like that. The actual real evidence or physical inscriptional evidence, it comes from quite a bit later. We've got Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in the Quran, in the Old Testament. Then we're talking about 10th century BC. Certainly, I don't think there are inscriptions in Sabaic that early, but I think there are from like the 7th century BC, something like that. And Sheba, was certainly around until about 300 AD, and then it was sort of subsumed into the Himyari. The kings of Himyar call themselves the kings of Himyar and Saba. You said, did they regard themselves as Arabs? And the answer is no. We can tell this because Arabs begin appearing in the Sabaean inscriptions about the year dot, about 0 AD or 0 BC, something like that. And they begin to appear as probable people coming from the north and being used as mercenaries by the kings in the south. So they were obviously somebody that they were regarded as different. But the extraordinary thing is that they spread quickly in the south, and their language seems to have spread very quickly in the south. And it seems to have overcome the old southern languages, which were a slightly different language group. Nobody's quite sure of exactly how this happened, but so rapidly in the first centuries AD, you've got Arab tribes settling and spreading around the south, and Arabic, the Arabic language. So when people say, the origin of the Arabs is in Yemen, and I would say, well, strictly speaking, that's not true, but those Arabs who went to Yemen, they kind of Arabized Yemen. And then when you got Islam coming about, there weren't so many Arabs. There were a lot of Yemenis, and Islam had to rely on people from the Old South. So they were kind of drawn into the movement of Arabs going out and conquering and Islam spreading. So I would turn it on its head and say, more importantly, that a lot of what we think of today as Arab does in fact come from the South.
This very important statement you made me to move on to the next question, which is all about this movement and what caused this movement from the southern part of Arabia toward the north. I would read a few verses from the Quran, which you have translated into English. The verses tell a story of a significant incident in Sabaean lands, which remarkably impacted the Arabs' future forever. There was for Sabah a sign in the dwelling place, 2 gardens, one on the right hand and one on the left. a fair land, and a forgiving Lord. But they turn away. So we sent against them the flood of the dam, and we gave them instead of their 2 gardens, gardens of bitter fruit and tamarisks, and a few lot trees. And so we made them as tales once told, and we scattered them far and wide. These are very strong verses. You translated them. What are the tales once told? Can you tell us a little bit about these verses and the context?
Yeah, actually, I missed out a couple of. I skipped a couple of verses. So the tales once told in the Quran, that comes a couple of verses later. It's very, very powerful language. I think, forgive me if I don't remember exactly, but I think it's mazzaqnahum kulla mumazzaqin. We rip them apart in every direction, and we left them as ahadith, tales. It's somehow that I think the word tales is usually interpreted as meaning cautionary tales. A story that you read about and you say, oh God, I shouldn't be doing this to myself. And this is really the importance of that story in the Quran, that it is a cautionary tale. We could look at it as an allegory. The 2 gardens, the north and the south, the right and the left, and the 2 parts not getting on. And this is having seen recent Yemeni history. It's also an allegory for if you don't work together and preserve the dam, if you don't have this mutual coexistence on the land, and if you don't thank God by producing the crops, everything falls apart. I'm far from being an Islamic scholar or interpreter of the Quran, but I see that story as haunting Arabic history.
For the people who don't know the context about this tale and what happened for the dam, what was the story behind it?
Yeah, well, the dam at Marib, amazingly, it's still there. Not the actual wall that held the water back or redirected it, but the side bits, the sluice gates, they're still there. It's amazing to be able to read about something in the Quran and then to go and actually see it and touch it. An actual physical thing that was a pre-Quranic story. It was very much in people's minds during that early Islamic period. The Quran talks about Sayl al-Arim, and al-Arim it probably means something like, it's a word for a dam, the flood of the dam. Probably the last gasp of that dam did take place sometime in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. But the process of its slow decline had been going on probably for hundreds of years before that. Silt building up, people not getting together and cleaning it out, and this led to that final collapse. And also, it's always seen as a great turning point in Arab history.
Why so?
Well, that people migrated. So there's very much this feeling of being the source of migrations.
So the misery the dam destruction caused resulted in the massive migration of southern people coming toward the north, right?
Yeah, I think where it's wrong in the popular imagination is that there was sort of one great dam burst and one great migration. I think it had been going on for a lot longer than that, and there is evidence for this. And you can see migrations, you can follow them even in mentions of tribal names in Latin sources from a couple of hundred years earlier than the 6th century, or whenever the dam finally broke. So it was a longer process, but it's always stood as a kind of cautionary tale, as a warning. And it's a useful thing because it's such a symbol, the collapse of a dam. And, all the folklore that grows around it, that the seeress foretold that it was going to happen because she'd seen tortoises lying on their backs and urinating in the air. There are all these kind of weird folkloric accretions, and it was and is a kind of central point in Arab history. But in reality, it was a longer process, I think.
I love the fascinating folkloric stories you graphically described in your book about the collapse of Marib Dam and foretelling of the king's seeress. Given this background, now we can explore another relevant theme, which is all about the destiny of these migrated southern tribes and how they ended up in the northern Arabia. Let's first listen to a passage from Ibn Battuta as he was passing by the ruins of these migrated tribes and their kingdoms in Iraq, and we will get back to pick up our conversation.
After we had enjoyed the privilege of visiting the tomb of the commander of the faithful, Ali, peace be upon him, the caravan went on to Baghdad. But I set out for Al-Basra, accompanied with a large troop of the Khaffaja Arabs, who are the occupants of that country. They are very powerful and violent, and there is no way to travel to those regions save in their company. So I hired a camel with the commander of that troop, Shamir bin Darraj al-Khaffaji. We set out from Mashhad Ali and halted first at Al-Khawarnaq, the seat of the An-Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir and his ancestors, the kings of the house of Ma-is-Sama. It is still inhabited, and there are remains of vast domes lying on a wide plain on a canal derived from the Euphrates.
Driven by the dam destruction and the huge loss it left behind in the southern Fertile Crescent, some of the settled Yemenites were compelled to migrate northward in the Arabia Peninsula into territories which were inundated with an intense rivalry between two giant empires, the Persians and Romans. During the whole of the 5th and 6th century AD, how did the major Arab tribes find their ways in this borderline place? Which I know that you have called it a great game between these two rivalry empires.
Yeah, it was very much a great game. And I think there are the two big names. And you mentioned Ibn Battuta mentions in Oman, and he belonged to a dynasty called Lachem, or a tribe called Lachem. And so we call them Lachmids. You know, the other famous ones were the Hassanids. Their migrations were actually before the final collapse of the dam. And I mean, they took place several hundred years earlier. They came up from the south, and people went up from the south even to Medina. You know, when the Prophet Muhammad has his hijrah to Medina, many of the inhabitants were from the south there. Yes, you got these people going up to the north, settling. Some of them, Ghassan, seem to have migrated as a tribe, and they got to Roman territories in Syria, and the Romans said, okay, now, yes, welcome. Ahlan wasahlan, settle down, but you've got to pay taxes. And some of them agreed, but some of them went back. So that was a kind of confrontation with a different world. But the ones who stayed became client kings looking after the border. And then something similar with the Persians on the east, northeast Arabian Peninsula with the Lachmids. The Lachmids were very, very important in the formation, Lachmids and Ghassanids, but particularly Lachmids were important in the formation of Arab identity.
In what term? Confrontation between the empires and their own identity, on a search for their own identity.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't sort of subsumed or absorbed into these neighboring empires. They remained as distinctive entities. It seemed that they became conscious because they were rubbing up against these very powerful forces. They became conscious of their own identity. You got the idea of, again, particularly with the Lachmids, of we are Arabs and they are Ajam. Arab and Ajam, and Ajam are really, they're people who don't speak Arabic. If you're, these days in Arabic, if you're Ajam, you're mute or dumb in the sense of not speaking. Again, language is being a very formative force. And of course, you get this in other parts of the world. And for that matter, barbarians in origin are people who they can't speak clearly. They in their speech. So being up against these empires, it very much kind of molded Arab identity.
Beautiful. I can see that there is a strong link between the Arab identity and their language. And also, I'm very captivated by how you elaborate the role of words and rhetoric in Arab culture. As you put it, like a defensive walls, offensive weapons, and portable cultural products. Share your insights with us on these notions. Are they related to this atmosphere?
Yeah, the defensive wall, talking about language, it's us being Arab and them being Ajam. So you're setting up your language as a defense, as a bastion. I mean, certainly offensive weapons. Arabic has been used from very, very early times as an offensive weapon. There's a whole class of poetry called hijab, which is sometimes translated as satire. But, things like battles. Battles would usually begin with skirmishes, not with physical weapons, but with words. So you get a poet going from each side, and they would slag each other off in poetry, sometimes funny, sometimes, really quite nasty. You're a fat-bellied idiot kind of thing. Your mother was a this and a that. Your father's, did this and that, and you weren't properly conceived, all that kind of thing. So words very much used as offensive weapons in that sense. Portable product. Yeah. If you think about it, words are the most portable product of a culture, aren't they? Poetry, think of the tracks that the camel caravans went by, and poetry, which I must say, probably from an early time was in this sort of quite elevated language, not what people would speak every day, but that people would appreciate and use and they would remember, and they carried it with them. So, you've got to think of people sitting around a campfire, somewhere in the north of the peninsula, and they say, oh, have you heard the latest verses by so-and-so? And then they traipse off and they go right down to Yemen and so on. They take this with them. Like the famous souk at Okaz in what's now Saudi Arabia. Yeah, and you had sort of competitions between poets and orators and people like that, and they would dress up rich clothes. It was a bit like pop concerts. The Glastonbury Festival is the one I think of in Britain, and people would come and listen, and they would go crazy and express their appreciation for these poets. In time, this is how the Quran spread. Of course, the Quran most definitely not being poetry, but it uses a kind of similar, very elevated language, and it spread, first of all, orally. It's a portable cultural product, and this meant that Islam was very easily portable. Think of Christianity. You need a priest with this and that and the other. You need an altar. You need the sacrament. But Islam focuses on the word, which is absolutely portable.
So the words find their way much easier than anything else.
Yes.
I would like to know when we're talking about the Lakhmids and Ghassanids sitting around the fire and the night time, and they are boasting with the words and with poems. What is like any written language at the time, or was it all like an orally thing?
Well, no, this is a very good question. I think that the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, in the sense of the dynasts, the kings and their courts, they had palaces or at least tented palaces, and they lived in a certain amount of luxury, and then it spread out to the campfires from those centres. There's a lovely story about one of the Lakhmid kings, a Nu'man, and lots of them were called a Nu'man. Which Nu'man was it? It's a bit like Louis in France. I think he was a Nu'man III. And he's supposed to have commanded all the poetry of the Arabs to be written down, and then he had it put in a chest, and he had it buried under the White Palace of Al-Hira, which was their capital. It's something that I use as one of my kind of introductory anecdotes, because it shows that somebody who was very wealthy and, enjoyed having Persian luxuries around him, and probably Roman ones as well. But, the treasure that he hid away and was most proud of was poetry. Now, whether it actually happened, I don't know. But the story goes on that somebody dug it up in Islamic times, and there were all these wonderful poems. This is why the scholars in that particular area were so good at their knowledge of pre-Islamic poetry, as they found this treasure.
But except from those anecdotes, do we have any sort of evidence that from the written Arabic before Islam, from those areas between Lakhmids and Ghassanids, each one was client kings of an empire?
I'm not sure. I'm not a sort of brilliant epigraphist, so I'm not 100% sure. But, like the earliest substantial inscription in Arabic was actually for one of those Lakhmid kings. It's on his tomb chamber, but it's written in Nabatean characters. And Arabic script actually comes out of Nabatean. Again, you can't have a hard and fast line between them. So, if the story of the writing of those poems is true, what would they have been written in, Nabatean or something more like Arabic? I really don't know. But there's talking about written Arabic and Islam. I would say again what I said before, that Quran is really the first Arabic book. It benefited, and Islam benefited from Arabic starting to be written at about that time. And the migration of the Prophet Muhammad was 622 AD. And it seems that like the end of the 6th century, the Meccans were beginning to write, possibly in something that was Arabic or like Arabic, to keep their accounts. There's a lovely poem. It says something like, it congratulates the Meccans just before the time of the Prophet's migration. It says, oh, look at you Meccans, you lucky people, you're businessmen. Now you can keep your accounts in your own script. You don't have to use the script of the Romans or the script of the Persians or the script of the Sabaeans. And for me, that is an absolutely seminal poem, because it says that the Arabs have now joined this sort of club of empires, Roman, Persian, ancient South Arabia. They've now got their own script. You know, that's partly why Muhammad is the Nabi al-Arabi, because he was the one who had the scripture in the Arabic language. And it's why the Quran points out things like, you know, God has taught us by the pen. Quran itself means a recitation, and probably means an oral recitation. But the pen is very important in the Quran as well. And it was just really coming into prominence at about that time.
Yeah, it seems like a words and scripts and Arabic language like a central ingredient of the Arabic culture.
Absolutely, and there are these wonderful stories about the verses of the Quran descending through the angel Gabriel to the prophet, and then his companions writing them down on bits and pieces of pottery and leather and bone and so and so. You can actually see a technological advancement, which is the use of a script, the use of writing, playing this incredible role in the advancement of history.
Fabulous. Let's pivot into another main ingredient of your book, unity and disunity, as a cyclic theme across Arabs' history. How united or disunited were Arab tribes in the centuries before Islam, and what dominant causes were gathering them together or splitting them apart?
I would say that in the century before Islam, they were very disunited. And the Arabian Peninsula was a very turbulent place. It was full of wars. And if you use the word Ayyam al-Arab, the days of the Arabs, Ayyam al-Arab, but it has a specific sense of the battle days. It really comes to mean the battles between the Arabs. And this is, a lot of the poetry of that amazing century, the 6th century, the later 6th century, and into the early 7th century, when poetry was really taking off. It comes out of these battles and these conflicts and intertribal rivalries. And there's the famous one about that started off with the camel being allowed to graze in somebody else's grazing lands. You know, it sparked off a war of supposedly of 40 years between two tribes. And this is where Islam comes into it and why it's so central to Arab history. Even if you're writing a history of Arabs like me, you can never take the Islam out of it, of course. And it's because Islam sort of took all this activity and it redirected it outwards, northwards. So you had this sort of whirlpool of turbulence in the Arabian Peninsula, and Islam opened the channel to the north at a point of some weakness in the Roman and Persian empires, and out it all flowed. In a sense, people who start histories of Arabs with Islam are starting at the absolutely pivotal point in Arab history.
Interesting, I see. So Islam transfigured the nature of relationship between the tribes, in some extent, at least.
Yes, absolutely. Between tribes and also between the tribes and those settled peoples of the south. Another poet says something like, were it not for the swords and lances of Himyar or Saba, I can't remember which one, but were it not for the swords and lances of those southerners, the Arabs wouldn't have made their conquests. You know, I think it's a very important point. And this is what people mean when they say that, the southern Arabia is the original fount of the Arabs. But what they mean is it's the source of the manpower for the great Arab expeditions out of Arabia, the spread of Islam that went with it.
A lot of other things I would like to ask, but I would move on to my final question. Something very special in Arab culture, which is called Arabiya, translated into high language of Arabs, and Asabiya, rendered into the spirit of solidarity. How have these terms evolved throughout history, and what role do they play in molding Arabness as an identity?
Asabiya, I mean, it's a term that I've borrowed and lots of people have borrowed from Ibn Khaldun. It's come to have different meanings these days, but in the way he uses it, he generally uses it to mean something like group spirit, sense of togetherness. I mean, it means something like, the verb asaba means to bind together. So asabiya is something like bindedness. And sometimes it's translated by the French phrase esprit de corps, group spirit, group feeling, group solidarity. The way Ibn Khaldun explains things, he says that this is generated and felt by certain people at certain times in history. In Arab terms, I would add the Arabiya to the Asabiya, and they go together nicely because there's only one letter different, of course. But the Arabiya for me is the Arabic speech. It's the speech of the Quran, similar to the speech of the old poets. So it was really the Arabiya that I would say glued the identity together. And then, the Asabiya was a binding force. So not only are Arabs glued together, but they're also bound together. And they're also molded by forces from the outside, which is the empires. And this is really why I make the point of these two terms being so important. Arabiya, Arabic, but that particular High Arabic, Arabiya, wa Asabiya, Arabic and bindedness. Really in the sense, unity and disunity, we could talk about till the cows come home. But Ibn Khaldun, who, he's a good person to finish on, really, because he is so insightful about these things. He really says that to be really great, you need to have divine inspiration as well. So he talks about the Prophet Muhammad. I think he says the phrase he uses was that he jama' al-Arab ala kalimat al-Islam. He brought them together upon the word of Islam. So that to me that's exactly my Arabiya and Asabiya working together. Even today, in Yemen, they talk about the Sheikh is the one who has Jama' al-Kalima, who has brought people's word together. So the language and the group feeling, they kind of feed into each other.
Marvelous elaboration. Thank you very much, team. It was very insightful conversation and I learned a lot and I enjoyed a lot. And I was wishing I could discuss many other details, but finishing with Ibn Khaldun can be a good point, and maybe we can make an episode about Ibn Khaldun, which he deserves.
Oh yeah, definitely. Did I say at the beginning I'm producing a new edition and first English translation, first complete translation into any language of his autobiography. It's an absolutely fascinating book.
And we look forward to your new work.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that as well.
Our editor and creative consultant is Kate O'Connell. Erdogan Kars from Monash University and Ashkan Bahrani from Al Akhawain University are the content advisors. Frank Joachim read the passages from the Travels of Ibn Battuta. The music is composed by Ali Gogin and Tia Goodwin, cover art designer. All the passages from Ibn Battuta observations have been selected from the English translation, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, translated from Arabic to English by Hamilton Gibb and Charles Beckingham, published for the Hargrove Society in 5 volumes. You can follow Oriental Journeys on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also check out our website www.theorientaljourneys.com, which contains key information and codes on each episode.